My day started just like all those before it that month. Dark, lonely. I got up around 7:30 like usual. Nothing was happening. Nothing ever was. November was always one of my favorite months, a gateway to winter. I usually only went in the woods in the wintertime. Ticks scare me. You never know what they could be carrying. I live in a densely forested part of the United States. Won't say where, but there's tons of forest, streams, rivers, etc. It was a very boring and lonely few weeks leading up to my decision. There was nothing going on and nowhere I had to be, so I decided I was going to go hunting. I collect guns and military gear, rifles, shotguns and handguns, backpacks, jackets, tactical accessories, etc. I've never been in the military, but I like the stuff. I wear combat trousers tied around my combat boots nearly every day. I chose all the basic stuff to take with me: backpack, sleeping bag, tent, just all the necessary stuff to be out there. For my guns, I brought my Remington 1100 TAC-2 semi-automatic shotgun and my Ruger Super Red Hawk 44 Magnum revolver. I also brought a bottle of Sazerac whiskey and a small box of cigars. When I first picked up my gear, I realized how heavy it really was, but decided to carry on into the forest anyway. I left my house and began walking down the edge of my property towards the woods beyond. Everything was perfect at the start. Perfect temperature to note. A nice cool 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I always liked it cold. I picked a great day to start out. The sun was out, not a cloud in the sky, and it wasn't supposed to rain for the next week. Before I left, I had made myself my favorite sandwich for lunch. Honey ham, thick, sharp cheddar cheese, and kettle chips, which I like on my sandwich. They give it a nice crunch. About 3 miles into my hike, I sat down on a downed tree and pulled out my sandwich. I had made it so I wouldn't have to prepare myself one of the MREs I brought, at least not until later that night. The forest was beautiful that day, birds chirping, and I didn't see too many deer, of course, from the leaves crunching underneath my boots. I had a long hike ahead of me, around 28 miles of forest, trying to reach a certain part of the forested land. I reached a creek and decided I would jump it, so I tried and failed. My boot hit the water and my sock was soaked instantly. That put my day back pretty far, since the water was freezing and I had to stop and dry my boot out, which meant starting a fire. I couldn't continue with a freezing foot, so that was basically the end of my day. Before I set up my camp, I had to dry the damn boot out, so I collected some tinder, some round rocks, and lit a fire. I warmed the rocks up and stuck them in my boot so it would dry it out. I attempted to set up my tent with one boot on, but it just wasn't happening, so I decided I would just use my hammock for the night, so I set that up instead. The night air was cold and dry. The sounds of the forest around me, I fell asleep to the light of the fire. I awoke at some point in the night to a crash in the forest. I sat up sharp, frightened, but I figured it was most likely a falling tree. I fell back asleep soon after. The next day started well, but very cold. By this point I was running low on water, so at some point I would have to boil some water today. I started down the trail, which wasn't really a trail, just a way I knew in the forest. It was about 11 a.m. when I decided if I was going to continue, I was going to need that water. Luckily, I was walking beside a nicely flowing creek, so I started a fire and gathered some water in the pot I had brought. My bag was large and heavy, because it had things I needed to be out in the forest for that long. The pot came to a nice rolling boil, so I removed it from the fire. I bottled my water and I was ready to continue. Before I was to continue, though, I thought I would have a cigar. This set my day back an hour and a half, so it was now midday, around 12:30 p.m. I heard something loud far off in the forest. An odd coincidence, I thought to myself, but I still had to press forward. It had been a while since I had eaten, so I found a nice spot by the creek with a nice amount of sunlight and began preparing myself an MRE. I always liked those things, regardless of things you see on the internet about them being nasty or tasteless. If you get the right one, they can be great. Chili and macaroni, one of the best. I began heating up my food in the heater bag, provided in the MRE. Hot food was a great motivator to carry on, really picking up the mood. High in calories, you really only need to eat one a day. I poured some of my drink mix into my bottle and picked up my gear. I started once again walking along the creek, just as I had before. After about 30 minutes of walking, I smelled something. A familiar smell. The smell of death. I was the curious type, so I naturally wanted to investigate. I followed the smell for a few minutes until I found its source. A deer carcass. What I was looking at was something I had never seen before. The carcass was missing its front legs and looked as if it had been turned inside out. Almost unexplainable, as it was just a mess. The intestines had been strewn everywhere, blood and fecal matter spread across the leaves and pine straw. What could have done this? I vocalized to no one in disbelief. The longer I looked, the higher the risk of losing my chili and macaroni was. I had to step away and compose myself. At first I thought maybe a bear, but there was no way this was a bear. The damn thing was eviscerated. I did some closer investigating and a thought popped into my mind, so I got closer, reached down and stuck 2 fingers in between some folds of flesh. The fucking thing was still warm. It was time to go. I picked up my bag and began quickly down the edge of the creek. What the hell had I just witnessed? I wanted to get as far away from that thing as possible. Still shaken up about the previous event, I tried to forget about it, but it just kept me wondering. I was still about 20 miles from my destination, so I had to keep pressing on, for I only had about 3 hours of sunlight left. I reached a small clearing, which I decided I was going to set up my small camp in for the night. I had about an hour of sunlight left, and the creek was a short walk away. I walked towards the creek with my pot to collect some water, got to stay hydrated. When I made it back to camp, I set the water down and started my fire, which I had already collected the tinder for prior to going to get water. Daylight was fading quickly, so I set up my tent while the water was boiling. When I sat down by my small fire to take a breather and collect myself, I thought I heard something out in the woods which sounded like footsteps. Just an animal, I thought. But my mind wandered back to that deer I found earlier on in the day. Could it be a bear? I thought at first, but it was pretty far off and sounded like it was moving in a different direction, so I wasn't worried about it. I crawled into my one-man tent with the front flap open so I could see my fire about 7 feet away. I cracked open the bottle of whiskey I had brought. It was cold, just from the night air. I took a couple nips off of the bottle and settled in for sleep. I laid down, and a few seconds later, a loud asterisk, pop asterisk, echoed through the forest, like a live tree branch breaking. It scared me, a lot, so I grabbed my shotgun from the side of my bag. Already loaded, thankfully, I didn't want to make much noise. 12-gauge buckshot. My fire was just coals now, the dull glow illuminating the ground in front of me. I didn't hear anything else, but I sat there at attention. I wasn't going to get much sleep anyway. Ever feel like you're being watched? Yeah. You know that feeling? It's horrifying. Sometime in the night I dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was up, which was comforting. I checked around my camp to see if anything was different. Luckily, it wasn't. I tore down my tent and packed up my stuff. I had to get going. I was already going to have a late start. I started down the trail once again, just happy I was free from the troubles of everyday life. A couple hours into walking, I realized I wasn't familiar with this part of the forest, and I was curious to know where I was, so I climbed a nearby rocky hill. On my way up, I saw something odd, a rock overhang that didn't look right, so I went to check it out. After making my way around so I could see the front of the rocks, I saw it wasn't just an overhang, it was a cave. I've always been an explorer naturally, but sometimes I did some stupid shit, like going into unknown caves alone. If you fall down a crevice, you're dead no matter what. My curious nature wouldn't let me leave without seeing the inside of the cave first. I set my bag down and pulled out my mag light and walked towards the mouth of the cave. I shined my light inside the cave. A tunnel was illuminated, and I was just too curious. I walked into the cave and began down the rocky tunnel. The tunnel began a left-hand turn, which I couldn't see around. When I was able to, I saw it opened up into a room. The room wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either. The first thing I noticed was the smell, musk and rot. The second thing I noticed were the bones. They were everywhere. I thought it must have been a mountain lion den, but I wasn't worried, not with my .44 Magnum. I shined my light around the chamber, didn't see anything living, so I walked further in. My light fell on an opening at the other end of the chamber, another tunnel. I walked around the first chamber, seeing what I could find. That's strange, I thought, as I had found pieces of clothing lying around. A bright orange jacket, shredded and stained with black splatter. Maybe a discarded jacket that a hunter had skinned a deer in, and the lion had dragged it back to the den because it smelled like deer blood. I wasn't exactly ready to try to venture further into this cave, but I pressed on a little ways. I'm just too curious. Bones crunching underneath my feet, I walked to the second tunnel, and it went off into the dark and split into two paths. The ceiling in here was quite high, so the darkness just ate my light. I decided to turn back. It was starting to get dark and I needed to find a spot to set up camp. I stood at the entrance to the cave for a minute to compose myself. I had a quick smoke and began to look for a spot to pitch my tent. I found a nice flat spot and started cooking my MRE while I set up my tent. I began eating my meal just inside the tent, with the flap open, and yet again I heard something, like human feet, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. What was strange was the distance of the sounds, the distance between each footfall, at least 10 feet between every crunch of the leaves. They were very close. I hadn't lit a fire, so I couldn't see anything, and I didn't dare turn on my flashlight, as I didn't want to alert whatever or whoever was out there. I was miles into the woods, so seeing another person at this time of evening was very strange. I waited a while with my shotgun, and I didn't hear anything else, so I went to sleep. Foolish. I didn't hear anything else, meaning I didn't hear it move away from me. I woke up to breathing outside my tent. I was mortified. The breathing was high up, like it was in a tree or something, but it was loud. I picked up my shotgun, which was laying beside me, and sat up slowly. The breathing continued as I sat there, motionless. It had not occurred to me before then, but I had left my tent flap open. Not that it would help much being closed. I clicked the crossbar safety on my shotgun off. It clicked a little louder than desired, as the gun was fairly new, and the breathing seemed to move closer to the surface of the tent, and I could almost hear sniffing. I was paralyzed with fear, gripping my shotgun in a death grip. Then it hit me. I was breathing very lightly through my mouth until now, and I took a deep breath through my nose. The smell of carrion and rotting flesh filled my nostrils as I winced from the smell. At that moment, I realized I was going to die if I didn't do something. I carefully slipped my .44 Magnum out of my bag, tucked it into my waistband, and picked up my flashlight. I listened for the breathing, and I aimed my shotgun at the roof of the tent where I heard the breathing coming from, took a deep breath, prepared myself, and fired. A thunderous roar emanated out through the still air, and I would have pissed myself if I wasn't already in motion. I bolted from the tent, clicking my light on as I ran through the forest. The creature roared again as I heard thunderous footsteps behind me, quickly closing the distance. Trees snapped and fell as the creature gave chase. I quickly changed direction and bolted right, jumping the creek with the adrenaline coursing through my veins. It had momentarily lost track of me, so I took the chance to turn around to defend myself. I shined my light around in the area I heard it, and I spotted what was chasing me. In the very short moments that I got to look at it, what I saw horrified me beyond belief. The thing was at least 15 feet tall, bipedal, with pale gray skin. Its head was similar to a dog's head, but much larger and longer. Spiraling horns shot out from the top of its head, each at least 3 feet long. Long, sharp scythe-like claws on its hands and feet. Pale, jet-black eyes trained on me. It charged me. Beginning to close the distance rapidly, I raised my shotgun and unloaded the tube into the beast's chest. 5 shots. Thank God I had bought an extended tube for my shotgun. The beast roared in pain but seemed only stunned by the shots. I turned and began to run yet again, trying to put as much distance between myself and the beast before it came to its senses and began to give chase. I ran faster than I ever had before. I slowed down momentarily, fumbling in my pocket for more shotgun shells, and luckily I found some. 4 one-ounce slugs. I loaded them into my gun, trying not to drop any as I jogged through the forest, holding the light between my teeth. A thought came to me. I remembered my light had a strobe function. Maybe it would disorient it, I thought as I ran. My heart dropped as I heard a roar and heavy footsteps pounding the forest floor towards me. I switched my flashlight to strobe and turned to face the beast. Through the flashes of light, I saw the creature making 10-foot bounds towards me on all fours. I focused the light in its eyes, as I assumed it was mostly nocturnal. In the moments I had enough time to think. The beast slowed down drastically as it tried to cover its eyes, fumbling to its right and ramming into a tree. It roared in anger, stood up on its hind legs, and splintered the medium-sized maple tree with its claws. I raised my shotgun, blasted all 4 slugs into the creature's torso. It roared in pain, but again seemed relatively unfazed. I reached for more shells, but found none. I had left them in my bag, which I had ditched when I ran from the tent. I still had a .44 Magnum and a pocket full of rounds. I drew my .44 from its holster on my hip, pulled the hammer back, and nailed the creature once in the head. The results from this shot ended in making the beast angrier. It threw its arms to its sides and roared a primal roar of rage and charged. I bolted right around a large pine tree as the beast was nearly on top of me. It smashed the tree with its claws, sending chips of wood flying at me. I dodged in between trees as I ran from it yet again. I turned yet again, hitting in the eyes with my strobe light, stunning it momentarily. I had no idea how far I had run, but I pressed on. The sun was beginning to rise, overcast clouds in the sky. Vision was gradually improving, working to my advantage. Still being trailed by the creature as I ran right out of the tree line and directly into a road. I had never been so happy to see pavement in my whole life. The sight of something man-made filled me with determination, as I had no intent of being shredded today. There was no way I could avoid it in the open, so I darted back into the tree line and began to run along the tree line down the road. I turned once again and unloaded the rest of my cylinder into the creature. It jerked in pain and frustration as I began to increase the distance between us. Then I saw it. Headlights in the distance, maybe a mile out. I was running towards it as it was driving in my direction, so the distance was closed quite quickly. When it was about 200 feet away, I ran from the tree line in front of the truck, a 1970s Chevy. It pulled closer and began to slow down as I ran towards it, yelling. The driver must have seen the creature running after me and screamed for me to jump in the bed, which I did. The truck tires screeched as it peeled away. We began picking up speed as the creature gave chase. It began to bound and leap on all fours as I opened the cylinder on my revolver and began to load each round. Just as I closed the cylinder, the creature had gotten close enough to reach the truck, slashing at the back of the vehicle, smashing the tailgate off. I unloaded the gun into the creature's face as it fell backwards. Unable to pick up enough speed to catch the truck again, it roared and bounded back into the forest from which it came. I sat back in the bed of the truck and began to laugh as the distance between that thing and I increased. Just glad I was able to escape with my life. If you're ever alone, deep in the woods, and feel like you're being watched, you probably are. Hey, my dear friends. If you're finding joy in our content and would like to support our channel, please contemplate subscribing and hitting that like button. Your support means the world to us and will enable us to bring forth more captivating and fresh content. And a beautiful comment, as striking as the beauty of your eyes, my handsome friend, would truly touch our hearts. I was lucky enough to have a job that allowed me to travel a lot in my late 20s and early 30s. I would usually only spend a couple days in one location, though, for work, so I was limited to how much I could actually do when I was staying somewhere nice. but I had a job out in Pennsylvania for a week and ended up finishing a day early, which meant I'd still have to stay there for an extra day before my flight. Since I never got to get out much, I figured I should use this time to my advantage and do something fun. I decided on a long trail that went through some of the pretty forests and trees here. I've always really enjoyed nature, but I felt like my job forced me to be inside buildings or planes all the time. So this was a good chance for me to enjoy the nice weather and scenery. I woke up early, but I actually had to go to the store to buy some hiking clothes as I didn't pack any with me. The trail was about an hour away from my hotel, and I ended up getting there just before 12 p.m. It didn't look like anyone else was there, which I was pretty happy about. When I looked up the trail online, it said it would take about 6 hours there and back, so this was pretty much an all-day thing. I had a little backpack with a water bottle and some snacks, so I brought that and started making my way down. The first hour was really nice. Just being alone on a path between the trees was really peaceful and a nice way to get some relief from my stressful work life. But as I was walking, I noticed a man sitting on the ground next to the path up ahead. He looked almost as though he was sleeping, with his head hanging down and a hoodie covering his face. As I started to get closer, he looked up at me, almost staring me down as I walked past him. I had no idea what to make of him, but it was a little creepy, so I continued to check behind me occasionally for the next few minutes as I continued down the trail. After a couple hours, I got a little tired and hungry, so I found a small log on the edge of the path and sat down to have a snack. I was probably there for 3 or 4 minutes before the man that I'd walked past earlier appeared down the path, making his way towards me. He was still a good distance away, though, so I decided to quickly pack my bag up and continue down the trail so I didn't have to interact with them. Apparently my plan didn't work, though, as only a few minutes later, I heard loud running footsteps coming up behind me. I turned around and saw the man jogging in my direction. I moved over to the side, hoping he would just pass by, but he ended up stopping right in front of me. I'll admit, I was pretty nervous and felt really uneasy about this guy. He didn't say anything and reached into his pocket, and then he holds out a wallet and says, and I could tell it was completely empty too. I told him that he must be mistaken and that I didn't bring my wallet with me. He responds, telling me that he knew this was my wallet and I needed to take it back. I honestly didn't know what to do or say, but I could see in his eyes that he was getting mad. I was pretty sure this guy was trying to do some weird trick in order to rob me or something. But I didn't know what other options I had other than to just listen to the guy. So I just said okay and picked up the wallet from his hand. Then he looked at me in the eyes, smiled, and said, "You're welcome." Then he began making his way down the trail. I stood there for a minute, processing the interaction I just had. Then I held out the wallet and looked at it more closely. It was one of those typical brown folding wallets and looked pretty worn and old. I opened it up and checked every pocket in it, but there wasn't a single thing in there. I was so confused, I had no idea what to think, but I knew I didn't want to run into this man again, so I just started making my way back to my car. It was 4 p.m. now, and I had a little over 2 hours to go before getting back to my car. I tried my best to enjoy the walk, but I couldn't stop thinking about what happened, and it kept making me more and more nervous. I was constantly looking around to make sure he wasn't following me, but finally I could see my car up ahead. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a long shadow on everything, and my car was parked facing the trail, so I was walking towards the front of it. Once I was a few feet away, that's when I noticed a man's shadow coming from behind the car, as if they were crouched down. I stopped in my tracks, staring at their shadow next to my car. I knew that running away would almost surely end badly, but I also knew that he was probably going to try and steal my car and rob me once I tried to get inside. After a few seconds, I quietly reached into my pocket to feel for my keys, then started walking towards the passenger door. I quickly unlocked the car and got in through the passenger side. I could hear the man instantly jump up and run straight for the driver's side door, but I locked it from the inside just before he tried to open it. He started banging on the window as I crawled into the driver's seat and turned on the car. I could clearly see it was the same man from earlier, and he began screaming at me to give him the wallet back. I ignored him and reversed out of there and onto the main road, where I drove away as quickly as I could. As I was pulling away, he ran back onto the path and into the trees. I guess my plan had worked, assuming it threw him off by not going to the driver's side door and gave me time to get in and lock it. There was a police station I remembered seeing on the way, so I stopped there and went inside to report the man and give them the wallet, and then I headed back to the hotel. I called one of my friends to tell them about it that night, as it was just such a crazy situation. It's pretty obvious he was either trying to rob me or steal my car, but I find myself still questioning what the purpose of the wallet was, as it didn't seem to have any real significance. Anyways, I'm just happy that I was able to make it out safely and without losing anything. I always carry a small pocket knife with me whenever I go for walks now, as you never know what crazy situations you can find yourself in. If you want to understand why I left the place I was at, you're really just going to have to hear the entire story. You won't believe it, of course, but your skepticism means nothing, because what I saw that night on the bayou has been with me ever since. In my mind, in my thoughts, and sometimes even in my dreams. It exists as a disturbing memory that I cannot shake away. That will never go away, just so long as I live. It will be one of those things so terrifying that it'll still be just as keen in my mind on my deathbed as it was the day it occurred. But whether or not you believe me, I'll tell it to you anyway. If not only to serve as a warning, a plea for caution, if you ever find yourself near the swamps late at night. At the time, I was working at a shitty little fast food place. The only thing worse than working at a shitty fast food place is working at a shitty fast food place on the night shift, by yourself, without a vehicle. Especially when you just so happen to live in the heart of rural Louisiana. Such was my case some years ago, the night this event happened to me. During this time, I lived quite a few miles away from the restaurant I worked at, and due to my lack of a vehicle or any access to a public bus system, I was dependent on others for my transportation to and from work. One night, after a busy evening of serving customers, I closed the store and locked up the restaurant. When I phoned for my ride, nobody answered. Now, I'm not here to throw a pity party, but I can't help but to express anger at the fact that the person who drove me to and fro to work was my roommate, who had a car but no fucking job, and I was basically the only person in our house who paid the rent at this time. And this loser had the carelessness to fall asleep, leaving me with no fucking option but to walk again. This was not the first time that this had happened. The first time this had happened, it took me an hour and a half to get home, walking briskly. And to those of you who have never been to the rural regions of Louisiana, you have no clue. Here we have what is called a bayou. It's basically swamp. Thick, murky, moist, frog-laden, mosquito-swarming, gator-infested, crappy-smelling swamp with thick, tall grass, cattails, cypress trees, and heaves of pond scum. And I just so happened to live on the bayou, all the way down a long dirt road with hardly any street lights and thick swamp on both sides of the road. There are no side roads, and the houses down this street are separated sometimes by more than a quarter-mile apart. It's not merely spooky walking down this road at night. It's fucking terrifying. You hear sounds, both real and imagined, coming from the bayou. Chirping, croaking, howling, grunting animals. The rustling of leaves and branches in the canopy of the cypress trees, and the splashing water from underneath them. That's the worst. You can hear the sound of something lurking nearby, abruptly dunk underwater. It can be a turtle, a snake, or an alligator. You never know. You just keep walking, with your teeth and hands clenched tight, hoping nothing crawls through the tall grass next to you and onto the road. Or, even worse than the subtle dunking sounds, the sudden splashes that happen when you're walking and scare a toad or frog and it jumps into the water.
The sound makes you almost shit yourself as you begin a running spree that lasts about 3 seconds before you realize what it was. And then you're left with your heart pounding so hard that the sound of your blood gushing in your temples scares you just as much. These are the types of things that happen when you're in the bayou. This is what I had to look forward to that night as my asshole roommate slept sprawled out on the sofa, with the television set probably tuned into reruns of the Three Stooges and the Marx Brothers. And don't get the impression that I simply called once and gave up. You can trust that his cell had around 7 or so missed calls, 3 very unfriendly voicemails, and several aggressive text messages. I could just imagine his phone laying in another room of the house, softly vibrating in my desperate attempts to reach him as he snored. But eventually I gave up, and having just about no other friends to contact in the area as a recourse, I stopped by the nearby gas station, grabbed an energy drink, and began my ways back home.
Now you must understand, the first 30 or so minutes of my walk isn't that bad. I'm still in the most populated part of town, and there are streetlights, stores, houses, and cars passing by in large numbers. That's important. If there are a lot of cars going by, you feel safer than when there are very few cars going by. Because when there are only 1 or 2 cars that pass you every 3 minutes, that means that there could be a psychopath in one of those cars. And they may have enough time to stop by and murder you without being caught. But if there are a lot of cars around, there may be psychopaths passing by, but they'll most likely not kill you then, because there are too many people around to witness the crime. At least that's my reasoning. I digress. No psychopaths pulled up next to me as I walked about this part of town. Next, there comes a time in my journey where I have to turn down several suburban neighborhoods and walk some streets to get where I'm going. And here's where things get a little less safe, and I have to be a little more cautious. There's less traffic down these roads, and you never know when some punk or gang may be hanging out in some empty lot or house, who might mess with you or try to pick a fight or mug you, or just take an empty bottle of malt liquor and bash your skull in. You know, as an initiation ritual or something. These are the thoughts that go through my head as I walk this region, and they keep me on my toes until I reach the point where houses become fewer and fewer and the bayou begins. This is where the dirt road leading to my home is, and that's where I found myself this night on foot. I looked down the narrow road. You can only see so far before it fades into misty darkness. I resented that I would have to spend the next hour walking its distance until I reached home. But anger took hold of fear when I thought about how all of this could be spared, if not for the neglect and carelessness of my roommate. When I got home, I was really going to have it in for him. I truly considered at that time the possibility of physically smacking his damned face. And with this thought in mind, I launched defiantly down the road. And the further I walked, the darker it became, until no light shined but the stars and a sliver of the moon above me. Very soon, the sound of any vehicle was completely non-existent. There was just me, the road, and the bayou, and whatever creatures dwelt there. I heard the crickets chirp and the frogs croak and the occasional bird coo. To avoid fear, I focused on their chorus and let their sounds preoccupy my mind. I walked watching my shoes press into the sandy dirt as I placed one foot in front of the other. I would count my steps until I reached 100, and then I'd begin again. I tried to lose myself in the repetition. My shoes became damper and damper, and I felt the soles of my feet become moist. I stopped counting to ponder whether I should smack my roommate with a wet sock, but my thought was interrupted when I glanced up for a moment and saw that I was not alone on this road. A sharp panic seized my heart, and I became very nervous. A long distance up ahead of me, I could discern the soft silhouette of a figure. It was so far away that I couldn't tell whether it was moving ahead or in my direction. I froze, and I could feel the blood gushing in my temples. What were the chances of there being some malicious punk wandering this street at night looking to rob me or pick a fight? This was the reassuring thought I had as I tried to convince myself that I was safe. I tried to keep calm, to not let my nerves get the best of me. I mean, whoever this was probably just as frightened of the prospects of me as I was of them, if they had already detected me. That is. I didn't know what to do. Run? There was only two directions. Continue walking? What were the risks? As I stood there, I saw that the figure was indeed moving in my direction, and its form was becoming more defined. And this was the time I began to notice how awkward it was moving. The figure didn't walk normal. It didn't bob up and down, like how a normal person looks like as they walk. What was coming towards me? It would seem, from my perspective, moved in short, quick, jerking movements. And I could see from what light was present how its twitchy limbs projected from its torso, and how it was getting closer, and how its head stuck out from a neck that was longer than any human neck should be, and how at this time I could now faintly hear the noises that it seemed to make, the sound of suckling, and how it was moving quicker, and how its face lifted, and I could see its eyes glare like glowing yellow beads, and how these wide, beady eyes locked onto mine, staring at me, and how it stopped, and how we both were there, motionless, yards away, looking at each other, and how it then let out the most ungodly, inhuman screech I have ever heard, like a pig being gutted. It squealed violently, and the sound resounded through the bayou, and the chirping and croaking of crickets and frogs stopped. Everything stopped, and the rumbling and humming was all that could be heard afterwards. The rumbling and humming of a motor ahead, a vehicle speeding towards us, tires racing loudly. The thing in front of me hunched over and turned to see the headlights beaming our way. It hissed, getting down on all fours, only pausing for a moment to turn back towards me, gawking at me with its wide eyes before crawling hastily into the swamp. The vehicle that scared the thing away was my roommate's car. He never saw it, whatever it was, and I never wanted to see it again. I moved as soon as I could, and haven't been there since. It was near the end of October last year, which always makes for the best hiking weather, as it's not too hot and not too cold. I had a group of friends that I'd go hiking with a lot, but most of them had jobs with no set schedules, which would make it hard to find days where we could plan a hike together. So often I'd go for some shorter hikes alone and just enjoy the peace and quiet. I had the weekend off, so I found a nice hiking and camping trail nearby and drove up there on Saturday morning. I had actually been on this trail a couple years before and had always wanted to go back. It was a loop trail, so it basically went in a big circle from the start, and it was around a day and a half long. I parked my car in a small gravel parking lot and made my way up to the trailhead. The first few miles were flat, and mainly just went through grassy fields before eventually leading into a forest at the bottom of a small mountain. At this point, it was probably midday, and I was well into the forest when I saw a man walking up ahead. He was too far for me to tell at first if he was walking towards or away from me, but as I continued forward, I realized he was walking towards me. This wasn't a very popular trail, and the last time I hiked it, I don't think I saw anyone. But it was the weekend, and I figured maybe he just had the same idea as me. As he got closer, though, I noticed he didn't have a backpack on. And this was pretty unusual, as I was probably 6 or 7 hours down the trail, and there was no way someone would go this far without even a water bottle. He waves at me once he's a few feet ahead. I returned the gesture to be polite, but still being cautious due to being in such an isolated area. As he passes, I hear his footsteps stop and the dirt crumble as if he turned around. I looked back, and sure enough, he's facing me, and then he asks me something really strange. "Where's your group at?" I wasn't sure how to respond, as all I could really think about was whether this stranger knew that I usually had a group, or if he was just trying to figure out that I was alone. Either way, it was unsettling and made me really nervous. I responded, telling him that they were on their way a couple minutes behind me. I couldn't think of anything else to say, but I definitely didn't want this man to think that I was alone. "Good," he replied, then smiled and began walking again. I continued on in the opposite direction, further down the trail. A few hours went by, and I spent most of the time thinking about that guy and how weird the whole situation was. The fact that he didn't have a backpack so deep into the hike made the whole thing even more unsettling. I decided I'd find a good place a little ways off the main trail to set up my campgrounds just to be safe. I found a nice flat area about a half a mile from the trail and pitched my small tent. The sun was starting to set, so I sat outside my tent and just tried to stop thinking about the guy. I had a pre-packed lunch made for the trip, so I got that out and finished it before laying in the tent to try and get some sleep. I was laying there for probably over an hour, unable to sleep, before I started to hear footsteps coming from the trees behind my tent. I froze, listening to them moving towards me. I tried to reason with myself in my head that it was probably just some animal or something, but the steps were all too recognizable as a person's. It sounded like they were 15 to 20 feet away when they suddenly stopped. I waited there for what felt like hours, laying still and listening intently with my heart racing. But there were no more footsteps. I knew they had to be waiting nearby, as I would have heard the footsteps fade out if they had left. Eventually, more hours had passed, and the sun was just starting to rise. I knew I had to get out of here at some point, and I was so tired that I was questioning if maybe I had somehow just not heard the footsteps going away. I unzipped the tent and lifted the flap up a little to peek outside, but I didn't see anything, so I got out and looked around. It was very quiet, and the trees were blocking most of my view, but from what I could see, nobody was there. After a few minutes, I cautiously packed up my tent, still looking around frequently, as I was definitely on edge, and every small noise would make me jump. I attached my tent to my bag and started heading back towards the trail as quick as I could, but I only made it a few steps before noticing clear footprints in the dirt just behind a tree that was right by where I had my tent. I began panicking and didn't even look for any more footsteps as I sprinted towards the trail. I was terrified now, as I knew there was someone stalking me in the middle of an isolated forest hours away from anywhere safe. Once I got back to the path, I quickly began walking back down the way I came. It was probably quicker at this point just to continue down, but I figured that whoever was watching me would probably be waiting for me to continue that way. Luckily, nothing else happened the whole way back to my car, which I didn't get to until nearly sunset. I told my friends about the strange man and what I heard and saw, and they all said that I was lucky to get out of there without anything else happening. I contacted the police just to report the suspicious activity on the trail, but not much was able to get done about it. I'm definitely more cautious when hiking and camping though, and I rarely go without my group of friends anymore. I will never know what that guy's true intentions were, and I hope nobody else has to know either. I'd always been afraid of Scorpion River. Ever since I was 8, I'd gone with my aunt, uncle, and older cousin into the wilderness of southern Arizona, where we'd spend 2 nights in their rickety blue camper. We weren't alone. Around 10 other families joined us for that December weekend. The adults sat around the fire, swapping stories of better days, back when the economy was stable and kids respected their elders. The 7 or so of us children quickly grew bored with the talk and went exploring. To call Scorpion River a river was an overstatement. Water only ran there once or twice a year. The rest of the time it was just an expanse of sand. Our campsite was close to the river, yet the sandy cliffs meant that one had to fight through half a mile of cat claws and ancient mesquite trees to get to it. Yet every day without fail, we'd make the trip. It was worth it to play games of tag in the flat sand, or to make forts below the huge cottonwoods which lined that part of the river. Every time an adult would come with us, much to our annoyance. They made sure we kept to the stretch of cottonwoods. The only time we were allowed to leave that was when the group of adults decided to hike to what we called the funnel. The funnel was a natural rock formation, a vertical tunnel cut up through the cliffs on the other side of the river. It was beautiful, a pipe of smooth reddish stone which seemed to lead up into the sky itself. It was easily my favorite part of the trip. The only thing I didn't like was getting there. To reach the funnel, we had to pass through what I called Raven Forest. Here the trees were close together,
the bark blackened by some ancient fire. Every time we went through, the screeching of ravens would fill the air. The light played tricks on your eyes, making it seem as if there were figures standing in the shadows. As I grew older, the feeling of unease grew too. I began to hear whispering in the trees, voices always too low to be understood, but distinctly unfriendly. I spoke about it to my cousin Jade, but she dismissed it, telling me it was my imagination. Every year, more and more strange things would happen, explainable, but just strange enough to put me on edge. Nothing stayed where we put it. Camper doors would open and close of their own accord. The campfire would sometimes flare without warning. My aunt and uncle once brought their German shepherd, thinking he would have a fun time running with the kids. For the entire trip, he stayed close to camp, whimpering whenever we attempted to get him to come down to the river with us. As strange as things got, nothing downright out of the ordinary happened. Not until one year, the year Jade and I turned 18, when my 16-year-old cousin, Mason, decided to come camping with us. He was a tall youth, big for his age, a football player with something to prove. As there were 3 of us and we were older now, my aunt and uncle decided we could go out by ourselves. Every chance we got, we went down to the river to explore, no longer hindered by the younger children. Jade and Mason often got annoyed with me, as I always refused to enter Raven Forest. Jade wanted to climb the trees, as she was going through a gymnastics phase, while Mason wanted to prove he wasn't afraid of an old, spooky forest. One evening, the two couldn't stand it anymore and told me they were going in whether I came with them or not. I declined, and the two disappeared into the woods, leaving me alone at the edge of the river. I sat down on the little cliff and waited as the sun began to sink below the tree line. I gradually became aware of a horrible smell coming from a nearby stand of bushes. I grew curious and went over to investigate. The bushes were low and thorny, forcing me to crawl to get through. I crawled on hands and knees over the uneven ground, finally stopping when my fingers touched something soft. I took out my phone flashlight and shone it on the ground. Instantly I was moving backward, ignoring the thorns which tore at my hair. For lying on the ground was a pile of dead songbirds, heads missing, surrounded by blood and ants. I pulled myself to the edge of the river and stayed there, breathing hard, trying not to throw up. Several minutes later, my cousins returned, talking and laughing. They stopped when they saw me sitting on the cold ground, shivering. "What happened?" Jade asked. I numbly pointed towards the stand of trees. The two of them went over to look, returning a moment later, faces grave. "What would do that?" I asked. "Some kind of predator," Jade suggested. "You know, like a fox, a coyote, something. Why would it just pile them up like that? There must be 50 of them, all lined up in a circle like—" "Let's leave," Mason interrupted. "It's almost dark." We started towards the other side of the river, walking at first, then running. "I really think we're overreacting," Jade said when we reached the other side and paused to catch our breath. "There must be some logical explanation. Maybe they just happened to be there and weren't arranged like it seemed. Did any of us look very hard?" "The heads were missing," Mason said. "Explain that." "They might have rotted away." The longer we talked, the more reasonable the birds seemed. After around 10 minutes of proposing theories, we were calm. Mason decided to try climbing the cliff to get to camp instead of going through the riverbed, which was muddy from a recent rain. He'd just gotten a new pair of red Converse and didn't want them ruined. Jade and I, knowing how many thorn bushes were between us and camp, decided to go down the river before going up the cliff. We split up. Once we were about halfway up the path, we heard rustling in the bushes. Thinking it was a deer, we ignored it and continued. Jade stopped to tie her shoe. "We should go up to the funnel," she said, bending down. "By ourselves?" I asked, scared yet a little excited. "Yeah, that'd be—" I stopped. Behind her in the thorn bushes was a dark shape. It was hunched, humanoid, though in the growing darkness it was hard to make out details. I glanced at Jade, and when I looked back it was gone. "What is it?" Jade asked. I pointed. There was something there. It was probably Mason. She stood up. Hey, Mason, get out here and stop trying to scare us. Oh, come on, he called. I was relieved until he stepped out of the woods on the other side of the trail. There was no way he could have moved that fast and that quietly. I tried to explain what I'd seen to the two of them, but they just laughed it off. We spent the night around the campfire, listening to my uncle play guitar. That night, nothing strange happened, and we all awoke early, eager to go on our trip. We left just after the sun rose over the cliffs. In the daylight, the forest was decidedly less creepy. We went around half a mile down the river before climbing the cliff. This was the first time we'd done it alone, but we were confident we knew the way. At first, everything went pretty well. We found a little trail and started towards the cliff ahead. But pretty soon, I began to notice that this part of the forest wasn't familiar. The trees were even closer together than usual, and even though the sun was by now high in the sky, it seemed dark. Then the coyotes began howling. Though I knew they weren't dangerous to humans, it was still eerie hearing them in the distance. Maybe we should go back, I suggested. Nah, Jade said. We can still find the funnel. Let's just get off this path. It should be like a mile west of here. I'll go first, Mason said. I've got a leather jacket and you don't. When we left the path, I thought I heard the whispering, though it was hard to hear over the racket my cousin was making by breaking a path through the trees for us. Finally, we reached a small stream bed, long since dried up yet not overgrown. A minute or two later, we reached a funnel. We all knew instantly it wasn't the one we were used to. It was smaller, yet went further into the cliff face, more of a canyon than a tunnel. As we entered it, I noticed something far up near the top, around 200 feet above us. It was too far away to make out what it was, so I decided to climb a little way up the side of the other side of the canyon. Meanwhile, Jade and Mason went farther into the canyon. I could hear them talking as I climbed as far up the wall as I could get. As I still couldn't see what it was, I decided to take a picture with my phone. I pointed it and snapped the picture, deciding to see if my uncle, who was into photography, could somehow enhance it. I started to climb down and tripped. I landed hard on the floor of the funnel, glad for my thick coat. I heard rustling in the bushes to my left and waited to hear the others laughing at my clumsiness. Yet no sound came. "Guys," I called. "We're up ahead," Jade replied faintly. I started to go after them, having to squeeze between the trees and under the bushes which clung stubbornly to the dirt floor of the funnel. Suddenly, I had the feeling of being watched. Again, branches cracked. I wanted to turn and tell whoever it was to cut it out, but my body wouldn't respond. I froze as the sounds grew closer and closer. The whispering increased in volume. Then the spell was broken as Mason called my name. The frozen feeling disappeared and I turned, ready to confront whatever it was. Nothing was there. I hurried to join my cousins, who stood below the object on the funnel wall. From here it was apparent that it was a bit bigger than I was. Something dripped from it, leaving trails of dark liquid on the pale wall. Around it circled several ravens. "Think that's a nest?" Jade asked before I could tell them what had happened. "Maybe," Mason replied, shading his eyes. We stayed there for a few moments, trying to make out what it was before growing bored. "Race you to the entrance," Mason called. He ran off through the trees, ignoring the thorny bushes. Jade and I followed more slowly, knowing we couldn't beat him. Then above the sound of our own footsteps, I became aware of a distant voice, rising and falling in some sort of haunting song. It sounded female, but there was something unnatural about it, as if we were hearing a recording played backward. "Do you hear that?" Jade asked. I nodded. We ran to the entrance of the funnel, where we met Mason. "Did you hear singing?" I asked. We were then confronted by a problem. We didn't know exactly how to get back to the river without having to push our way through thorn bushes. Finally, we had no choice but to start moving. Mason led the way, pushing through thorns and bushes without a care.
Jade and I followed more slowly, carefully avoiding the worst of the thorns. After a few minutes, the two of us were separated from him. We found ourselves in a circle of thorn bushes with no easy way out. "Mason!" I called. I nodded, feeling my muscles begin to lock with fear. From the direction of the funnel came the sound of something pushing through the trees. Jade's eyes met mine, and I knew she could hear it too. "We need to get out of here," I said, eyeing the thorns which surrounded us. For some reason, I had no idea how we'd gotten inside the little clearing. The sounds were growing louder, along with the whispering. All at once, I realized something. The voices had never been threatening me. They'd been trying to warn me. I got to my feet and pulled Jade up. "We're leaving," I said. I pushed through the bushes, ignoring the stinging of the cuts the thorns left on my arms and face. Jade followed, and we ran through the forest. At one point, I tripped and Jade pulled me to my feet. Behind us, the sounds were growing closer and more urgent. The voices weren't whispering anymore. They were screaming. For what seemed like 1,000 years, we ran through the forest. Though it was only a mile, it felt like 100. Finally, we ran out into the river, nearly knocking over Mason. The voices stopped, along with the crashing of whatever was pursuing us. "Where were you?" he asked as we tried to catch our breath. "I've been calling for you for hours." "Hours?" I asked. "We weren't apart for more than 20 minutes. He shook his head. "I was just about to go get help." "Nothing?" I asked. "We must have just imagined it." "Really, Jade? It was probably just some animal." We started walking back to camp, and soon I began to believe we'd imagined whatever had happened too. I heard the sound of the singing and ignored it, deciding I was imagining it again. Then I noticed that the other two were looking at me in horror. They could hear it too. We began running, not stopping until we reached the camp. When we told our story, the adults just laughed, blaming it on overactive imaginations. My uncle, who had been visiting the area since he was a child, claimed there was no second funnel. We soon packed up and drove home. As it was late by the time we reached our hometown, I decided to spend the night with Jade and go to my house the following morning. While we were there, I remembered the picture I'd taken of the thing in the funnel. I asked my uncle to enhance it, and he agreed. "It'll probably be a nest," he said as he worked. "You probably disturbed the ravens, which decided to chase you off." I didn't agree, though I didn't say so. "Oh, kids," he continued with a smile. "I used to be like you. One time I remember thinking—" He stopped, the smile disappearing instantly. He got up and backed away from the computer. Then he turned and ran for the phone. Jade and I looked at the now enhanced picture. The thing was not a nest. In fact, it was a body, headless like the birds we'd seen in the tree grove. Though the picture was still blurry, the jacket the figure wore was unmistakably black leather. On his feet was a pair of bright red Converse. Just then, the doorbell rang. "Girls!" my aunt called. "Mason is here!" My girlfriend and I always enjoyed going for weekend camping trips pretty frequently. We used to live right inside the Appalachian region in Virginia, so obviously we'd find new places on or near the Appalachian Mountains. Both of us had pretty stressful work lives during the weekdays, so getting out in nature and staying away from home on the weekends really helped us. At the time this happened, we had already been on dozens of camping trips in the Appalachian, but none of them had ever ended like this. It was Saturday morning, and we decided on a very small 3-mile trail that leads to a nice isolated camping ground on a flatter part of the mountain. We had never been to this specific spot before, but from the amount of reviews the trail had on Google, we assumed it was a pretty well-known trail and campgrounds. We got our bags ready and packed the truck with our camping gear, and then we made our way out there. It was only a 45-minute drive from our house, but as we got closer, it began raining quite a bit. This was pretty normal around the mountains here, so we were used to being out in the rain and didn't bother us enough to turn around. We pulled up to the trailhead, which was actually just off the side of the road, and we saw one other car parked on the side. We actually expected there to be more people considering the popularity of the trail, but we were glad it wasn't crowded. Though, as we started getting our gear out, my girlfriend pointed out that the parked car's passenger door was cracked open a few inches. We both looked around to see if the owner was nearby, but with no signs of them, I decided to go over and push it closed, as we assumed the owner must have accidentally left it open. The whole passenger seat was soaked from the rain already, but at least it wouldn't get any worse. And then, we both started making our way down the trail. We talked about how weird it was that the door was open, and how most people would probably notice that their car wouldn't even lock due to the open door. It's worth mentioning, too, that it was clearly a pretty expensive newer car, which just made it more strange. Anyways, the rain started picking up at this point, so we began walking faster so we could get to the campsite and set up our tent. I want to say it took us about 2 hours to get to the end, as it was mostly uphill. Once we were there, the first thing we noticed was a tent already set up in the middle of the flat area. It was pretty small, definitely a one-person tent. We figured they were probably in there sheltering from the rain, so we went to a far corner on the site and set up our tent there. We sat inside for an hour, eating some food we brought and laying some of our stuff out before hearing voices outside. The rain hitting the tent was too loud to hear what they were saying, so I unzipped the front and looked out. I jumped a little bit as there were two men kneeling down and looking at us from just a couple feet away, but then they smiled and introduced themselves. They said they were staying in the tent in the middle and that they'd been here a few days. I quickly introduced my girlfriend and I and told them that we were just here for the night. Then they headed back and I zipped up our tent and looked at my girlfriend. The whole interaction seemed a little off and they seemed to be acting a little strange. I noticed that both of the men were wearing tightly fitted jeans and regular t-shirts, and their tent was way too small to be fitting two full-grown men. It really just didn't seem like they were here camping or hiking, and definitely not for a few days like they had said. We decided to leave the zipper partially open so we can keep an eye on them just in case. Another hour went by and we didn't see anything unusual. Actually, we didn't see anything at all. I guess they were just cramped up in their tent the whole time. Anyways, it was pretty dark out at this point, so we decided to call it a night and get our sleeping bags ready. I zipped the tent back up and laid down next to my girlfriend. I must have fallen asleep pretty fast though, because I didn't even remember anything after laying down. But I woke up a few hours into the night having to use the bathroom. It was still raining, so I put on one of my cheap plastic rain ponchos so that I wouldn't have to go back to bed soaked. Then I headed out a few feet behind our tent and behind one of the trees. But through the rain, I could hear voices. It was really hard to tell where they were coming from. I turned my head all around, looking in every direction as I started to get a little paranoid, but I didn't see anyone. Then I looked over at the small tent in the middle and noticed the front zipper was open. It was hard to see in the darkness and through the rain, but I was pretty sure that nobody was in there. I knew that the men had told me that they were staying the night in the tent, so this started to get me even more worried. Ran over to my tent and shook my girlfriend awake and told her about the situation. She was clearly tired, but I could tell that she was just as worried as I was. As we were discussing what to do, we both heard it. Voices coming from behind our tent. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew sitting in the tent didn't feel very safe anymore. I told my girlfriend to pack the bags quickly and be ready to leave if we had to. Then I grabbed a small pocket knife and quickly got out and looked over at the trees. I saw the two men from earlier standing there, just a few feet from our tent. I remember this moment very clearly as both men looked at me with absolutely no emotion. They didn't make any facial expressions or even move at all. I knew at that moment that these men were planning on doing something horrible, and they were not scared of me at all. A second later, my girlfriend looked out of the tent, which took me out of my state of shock, and I yelled at her to go, pointing at the trail back down the mountain. I followed after her, leaving my bag in the tent behind. I looked back just as we made it to the edge of the campsite, and the two men were still standing there. They didn't even try to chase us or anything. They just stood and watched us as we ran away in total fear. I'd say we were full on sprinting for 10 minutes before slowing down and walking quickly for the rest of the way. When we got back to the car, we saw the other parked car was still there, but the passenger door was opened again. I immediately drove us down to the nearest gas station where we called the police and were met by them a few minutes later to talk about what had happened. A few days passed by and then we get a lot more information and it made everything even more terrifying. When an officer went down to investigate the area, they found that the car belonged to an older man who had recently been filed as missing. All of the belongings from the car had been stolen, and they were able to confirm that the tent on the campground was the old man's as well. They didn't find the two men, though, and they didn't find any real evidence other than their shoe prints. The old man wasn't found either, and as far as I know, he still has never turned up. This made my girlfriend and I both feel sick, knowing that we could have been just seconds away from something horrible. I guess we'll never know for sure what those two men were actually up to, but I think we can all make a pretty good guess based on the whole situation. But what I do know is that the image of those two men standing in front of me still haunts my memories to this day. I, a female, was 25 at the time. This was 2018 and I live with my boyfriend in our hometown. It's a small city that's relatively poor and has some drug problems and there's not much to do. My boyfriend's now husband was at his friend's house. It was a Saturday night and he said he'd be home around 9. He was about 2 towns over, maybe a 20-minute drive. At the time, we lived in a duplex, split upstairs and downstairs. It used to be a big house, but it was converted into a duplex. My cousin actually rented the downstairs apartment and she was kinda loud. I really knew when she was and wasn't home, and she wasn't home that night. The way our street was situated, the backs of the houses on my street and the parallel street, all faced a narrow alley, and the driveways were mostly only accessible this way. The downstairs had a front porch with a door and a side door. Our upstairs unit had the back door, and it was at the top of an outside set of wooden stairs. So anyways, I'm watching TV alone. I hear someone coming up the stairs and knock on the door. It's 8.30. It wouldn't be that unusual for my boyfriend to be home early. Maybe he got bored playing video games, or he just felt like leaving. I usually would unlock the door for him when he came home, instead of him having to use his keys because it was usually pretty dark and could be a hassle. So I got up and I opened the door to someone who was not my boyfriend. It was a pretty thin man, wearing too big of jeans and a hoodie. He had about 4 teeth and was teetering back and forth. I was so shocked considering I was positive it was my boyfriend coming home. The guy at the door asks me, "Can I use your phone?" Behind him, down the stairs and in the alley, I see a big SUV, Ford Explorer type of vehicle, just idling with someone in the driver's seat. I panic and said, "Yeah, hold on." I then shut and locked the door. I think I was more shocked that it was a stranger at my door and not my boyfriend than anything else. I hid in the living room behind the couch where he couldn't see me through any of the doors or windows, and I was frozen. Something was just telling me that this was not okay. After a few minutes, I hear him walking down the stairs. I go over to the door and see the car drive away down the alley. I called my boyfriend and told him about what happened, and he said that he'll leave. But like I said, it was a 20-minute drive. He was about to leave soon anyways, I guess. After he got home, I calmed down and honestly felt silly. Why not just lend him my phone? Was it really that weird? But then I thought about it more over the next few days. It was 2018. This guy and whoever was driving between the two of them, neither one of them had a phone. And it wasn't like they were having car trouble. What would they want a stranger's phone for? They also went down an alley into the backside of a house, up some stairs to ask for a phone. They didn't go to my cousin's front door downstairs. I would have heard someone on the porch. They didn't go to any other house, and I saw them leave the street entirely. Also, why go to a house to ask for a phone when there was no car in the driveway? And of course, Our battery-powered security camera was dead at the time. I genuinely am not sure what they wanted. If anyone has any idea or thinks I'm overthinking it, let me know and feel free to comment. But that creepy guy at my door, let's not meet again. Back in July 2022, my friend's parents were going out of town for a week, so he decided he'd throw a pool party since we were all going to be leaving for college in August. This story doesn't take place at the party, however, but rather on my drive home. I know it's irresponsible to drive drunk, but I was a stupid 18-year-old. We enjoyed the night and I smoked and drank, and once I got to around 2 a.m., everyone else started heading inside. I'd gotten a text from this girl I was talking to telling me to come over, so I wanted to leave the party. The host of the party knew I was crossfaded, and they breathalyzed me and made me stay for another hour since I was too drunk. They even threatened to call the cops on me if I didn't stay that hour. After an hour, I was more sobered up and they let me leave. They all told me to be safe and I headed out. By now, it was about 3 a.m. and nobody else was on the road. My friend who was throwing the party lived in the city close to downtown, and the girl lived in a different county out in the country. It was about a 40-minute drive total, and I had to eventually get off the highway and take the back roads. I had been having problems with the battery in my car, as it would randomly stop working at times. While I was all alone on a desolate back road, the urge to piss came over me, and I could not hold it. I came to a stop and hopped out to do my business. Once I finished, I hopped back in the car and tried to turn on the ignition, but it wouldn't start up. My heart immediately dropped, and I reached for my phone, but my battery was on 2%. My aux cord that charges my phone was broken, and now the car was dead, so I had no way of doing anything. I tried calling my brother since I didn't want to call the cops, since I had weed and alcohol in the car, but he didn't answer. I thought I'd give it a look myself and hopped out again. And without thinking, I turned on my flash and flipped the hood. I looked around and took the battery cover off, and right as I saw what was wrong with the battery, headlights started approaching me. I will admit I got a little nervous even as a 6'3", 185 lb guy. The car slowed down as he saw me and my car, and I groaned. I definitely reeked of alcohol and weed and didn't want to talk to any strangers, especially at 4 a.m. The car stopped with its headlights still on, and a man got out of the driver's side and asked what happened. I told him I was having battery problems and I didn't need any help, keeping my distance. The man tried approaching me and I backed it up more. He was a mid-30s, stocky white guy with a brown beard. I knew I could easily take this guy in a fight, but I was worried if he had a weapon or something. He smiled at me and said he only wants to help, and I told him straight up to fuck off. This made him pretty angry, and he started charging at me. My fight or flight kicked in, and I chose to fight. I threw a couple of haymakers, and one connected with his jaw, and it dropped him. I started kicking him in the stomach and stomping his head so I could knock him out unconscious. Eventually, I calmed down and quit, and he was not moving at all. In a hurry, I ran back to my car to fix the problem. I had recently been starting to keep a tool back in my car because of the recent battery issues, so I had the stuff to screw what had popped off back on. I used the remaining 2% on my phone to see, and I got it back in place. I immediately closed the hood and jumped back into the car, and the key worked, so I knew the car was back on. I immediately locked the car and left. My headlights revealed the man was still unconscious, and his head was in a pool of blood. I pulled out my phone to take a picture to send to my friends. That was right when my phone died. I decided I'd have to drive home and then call the cops. On the drive home, the adrenaline wore off, and the realization that it just happened finally hit me. It felt like I was in auto drive, if that makes any sense. The drive home was in silence. Once I got home, I charged my phone and went and looked at myself in the mirror. I washed my hands and went back to my phone and pressed the power button until it finally turned on, and I called the police. I told them my full story of what happened and told them where it went down. They said that they would send someone to where I said it happened, and they asked if I had a license plate, and I cringed. I had completely forgotten to grab his license plate. So now I had to hope that this guy was still unconscious, which was extremely unlikely since close to an hour had passed. I didn't even try to sleep because my mind was racing. Later that day, the police showed up at my door to tell me that they saw dry blood on the ground, but saw no sign of the man. I wanted to get a report of what happened for me. This is how my parents found out, and they obviously freaked out. I told the officers my story and asked if they'd be able to track the man from his blood, and they said they already put the DNA in a database and found no matches, so they couldn't even arrest the man. This is still the craziest thing to ever happen to me, and it probably always will be. This all happened when I was 21 years old. It took place in a small town outside of a huge city in the Midwest. This was 1981, and I worked at a fast food place, and I stayed open until 3 a.m. My husband at the time worked for a bowling alley as a manager, and he was never off work before 2 a.m. I was expecting my first child, and business was slow, so I was sent home at about 1 a.m. In the town where we lived, there was a large private girls' college. Women were being warned to lock their car doors because 2 males were still on the loose that were targeting women around my age. They were sometimes following them home and attacking them, or forcing them off the road alone late at night. The men were raping and killing the women, and they had killed at least 3 by this point. 2 of the women were found on deserted roads, and 1 in her apartment. There was no description of these men or what kind of vehicle they drove. Anyways, I left work, climbed into my car, and locked my doors and started for home. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my gut feeling told me something was very wrong. I figured out that I was being followed home. I took several turns around town, trying to shake this car, but to no avail. The advice given was that if you thought you were being followed, to drive to the police station. We had recently moved to this area, so I had no idea where the police station was. I was terrified and panicked, and I couldn't think what to do. Back then, we didn't have cell phones, and the payphones were in different areas around town, like the ones that you could drive up to, and you could sit in the driver's seat, put your window down, and the payphones had a longer cord to enable you to stay in your car and talk. You still had to deposit money in order to talk, even if you were calling 911. I thought briefly about trying to get to one of these phones, but I was too scared, and I didn't think I could have a coin ready in time, before these men could have time to approach me. My parents lived about 4 streets over from where I lived, and I decided the safest decision was to try to make it to my parents' house. I was still being followed when I got to my parents'. There was a short block you could go around by my parents', and I went around this block about 3 times, and every time I did, I honked the horn. You would have thought that laying on the horn would have discouraged these creeps from continuing to follow me, but it had no effect. If anything, they moved in closer behind me. I pulled into my parents' driveway, and these creepers pulled in right behind me, then turned their lights off, and I heard their doors open and shut. I was beyond terrified at this point. They were out of their car, one of them coming up on one side and one on the other. My parents' house was a split-level home, and you pulled up in front of a double-car garage. In order to get into the house, you had to go in through the garage door or the front door, and the front door was to the left of the driveway, about 2 car lengths away, plus a set of steps. I laid on the horn once again, and they still kept coming. My dad, who is retired in the military by the way, often stayed up late at night watching TV, and thank God that he did this night. All of a sudden, he turned the porch light on and burst out the front door. He assessed the situation instantly and started yelling at these creeps to get the F away from my car, all the while barreling down the steps towards them. At first, they didn't retreat very fast, but they must have thought better. My dad is very big-boned and about 6'4". He had a brother that played college football, and he wore a size 15 shoe. He made it to the front of their car and pounded on the hood of it before they were able to burn rubber reversing out of the driveway. While he was unable to get a license number because they didn't have a front plate, he was able to describe them and give the make and model to the police. The police told me how fortunate I was that my dad realized what a dire situation I was in. I still get chills thinking back to that night. I remember as if it were yesterday. My dad said he thought he heard a car honk more than once, and then he heard me in the driveway. He had just shut off the TV and was heading for bed when I pulled in. Thank God my dad acted so quickly, or I might not be writing this today. This incident caused me to be hyper-aware of my surroundings, and I never turn into my driveway without making sure I'm not being followed. Always be mindful of where you are, and don't walk around with your headphones on or phone pressed to your ear. You never know when you may be giving someone an opportunistic moment for someone with ill intentions. Know where your local police station is, and if you ever get the chills like I did, like something is wrong, drive into the police station, and the police are more than happy to help you. It's always better safe than sorry. The police ended up capturing these creeps about 2 weeks later, and they didn't get a fourth victim. They were both on probation for kidnapping and rape. They served their time and decided killing their victims left no witnesses. My dad is still my hero today. His quick actions prevented me from being the fourth victim. In the color, model, and make of the car my dad described was a description of what they were driving when they were arrested. I grew up on the top of this mountain that was mostly abandoned since the 60s when an old ski kill burnt down. There were 2 other full-time residents up at the top where we lived. The rest of the houses stood empty the majority of the time, or were abandoned. The history of this mountain dates far back, hundreds of years ago, before the colonization of Canada. There were 2 native communities at war. One lived on top of this mountain, one lived in the valley below. At the base of the mountain, the 2 communities were supposed to meet for battle. During the journey down, the valley tribe snuck up behind the mountain tribe and slaughtered all their women and children. When the mountain tribe returned home, they were apparently slaughtered too. On the entire mountainside, these vining wild strawberries grow, and it's said they grow from the spilt blood of the mountain tribe. Many people have died on this mountain. When I was growing up, there were hundreds of old crosses littering the twists and turns up the mountain. My father later became one of those crosses. In a small meadow surrounded by trees sat a small cottage. No driveways, and only an overgrown pathway to lead you to it. If you looked inside, their breakfast sat still prepared, oatmeal and eggs, untouched for years. The man that lived there was supposedly a fugitive who disappeared further into the mountains when the police came up and found him one day. We had these weird neighbors who would come 2 weekends a month from the city with their daughter who was my age. They would bring friends over, get high, drunk and naked, and have orgies in their yard or the forest. There was this eerie feeling you had while on this mountain, which was aptly named Forbidden. I stood looking out my bedroom window at night. I swear I could see things moving in the forest below. We had the highest concentration of mountain lions in the world, and I was often stalked home. One night my mother woke to the sound of the sliding door opening and closing. She walked downstairs, and my sister was standing there sleepwalking, whispering over and over, "Here, kitty, kitty." My sister had never been a sleepwalker until this. My mother grabbed her, closed and locked the sliding door, then flicked on the lights, and right there on the deck, pacing back and forth, was a cougar. My father also became a violent sleepwalker while living up there. He would have screaming matches with the wall, sometimes ended up throwing items around. This wasn't something he did until the last few years of his life. My father was a skilled driver and had driven up this mountain, and many narrower, steeper logging roads around the area, many times. A few months before the accident, I started having waking nightmares of my father's death. Something was telling me he was going to die. I remember waking up frequently and looking out the window into the forest during this period and feeling like something was communicating with me that he would die. He kissed me goodnight one night and went out the door to go to town with his friends. They left in separate vehicles, him first. From the accounts of what happened, it was a freak accident. They were driving below speed limit down a straight stretch nearing a cliff corner when my dad's truck suddenly lost traction and started skidding sideways towards the cliff. My dad opened the truck door and jumped out.
and the truck suddenly veered the other way and flipped onto him on the ground, something that physically shouldn't have been possible. It crushed almost every bone in his body. He survived for 8 days in hospital after being airlifted. The day he died, I knew again. I knew he was dead, and it was like this feeling that something was communicating this to me. I didn't need to be told. I was so sure of this feeling that I collapsed onto the ground the second I got this feeling and started screaming, "He's dead, isn't he? He's dead, isn't he?" over and over again. I was 8. I had never experienced death before. There's a lot more that went on up there to a lot of different people over the years. It's known locally as a haunted and weird place. Nothing good ever happens there. People do weird and crazy out of character things, commit heinous crimes, die, or just lose their minds. We moved when I was 9. I never felt that feeling again anywhere else. That feeling of something insidious all around you. I've only been up there a handful of times since, and every time I do, that feeling returns.
The summer of 2008 was a rough time to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years getting a degree only to find that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping, but that summer, it became an escape to the point of an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health while I worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June and unseasonably cold, wet, and cloudy. The daytime highs barely touched 50 degrees, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I wasn't going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funny enough, was to hike from Storm Lake, over Storm Lake Pass, and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to and requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving. The road is a narrow 2-track, winding its way through thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine. There are no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon. Maybe it's a plane? I thought, looking up into the rain clouds. But the sound wasn't getting closer or farther away. And the sound wasn't above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane or a truck or a bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away and I was left again with only the sound of raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout. It's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing. They taste like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. Building up my fire for the night, I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early and the rain clouds obscured the starlight. It was dark, really dark. The sounds of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort in starting to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire's crackling, I could pick up that all too familiar rumbling rising in the background. It was growing louder than before, and closer. I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. This noise was ruining my camping trip and my buzz. Frustrated, I yelled into the blackness of the night, "Hey, shut the fuck up, asshole!" Like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I realized that was not a convenient coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams. And I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs on the fire and retreated back to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sat there, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment, I had felt alone but safe. Now I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt there were a million eyes in that dark watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour. I was glad I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but knew I'd be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce. I could feel the rainwater pooling and moving under my tent. This storm wasn't letting up. The urge to get in the pickup and drive away was ever more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town. But I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy two-track road, would have been a death sentence. But I still needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night, though. I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain and kept the campsite well lit. I remembered the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. I didn't feel like I had drank that much to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my junk to the pickup and tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. before I finished picking up camp. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy bobsled track of a road, not once looking in the rearview mirror once. I have never been back to Storm Lake. I probably never will. Never.